All right. Good day, good evening, greetings to everyone. Thank you for being here with us today for Decolonize Everything, Filipinos on the Future of Global Development, Health, Human Rights, and Peace. I am Frankie Cruz from the UP Decolonial Studies program, and I'll be your somewhat casual and irreverent host for today's kwentuhan. For those of you who are not aware, this word kwentuhan is a Tagalog word derived from the Spanish word cuento, and it means to share stories in an informal manner. Before we begin, a few reminders. I'd like to remind everyone to kindly mute their microphones and turn off their webcams, unless of course you're on the panel. We will have a Q&A session a bit later, and we'd invite you to ask your questions in the chat. You may also turn on your mic if you have an urgent question or you somehow can't access the chat. I will moderate that, and I'd like to remind everyone to be respectful and constructive when asking questions. All right, I think we can begin. I will just let in a few people here from in the waiting room. All right. So the verb decolonize has often been touted as a buzzword, up to the point where some claim that it may have lost its initial meaning and potential. As we sit in front of our laptops, as the world creaks under the strain of the pandemic, growing authoritarianism, inequality, and social unrest, we'd like to take some time today to interrogate questions of access, of dignity, and enduring coloniality, while reflecting maybe on the irony of our own privileges. How can decolonizing be meaningful across disparate sectors and groups of people? How can its positive effects be channeled back and across people affected the most by injustice and inequality? Here to discuss this with us tonight are our four guests. Arbie Baguios, an international development professional and founder of AID Reimagined. Dr. Renzo Ginto, public health physician and chief planetary doctor of PH Lab. Attorney Ros Delgade from the Commission of Human Rights. And Reg Guevara, practitioner of regional peace and security. So maybe we can start with a round of brief introductions. You can let us know about your work, experiences, and what got you into this field and interested in decolonizing your own fields. Maybe we can start with Arbie.
Hi, everyone. I'm really thankful to be here, and thanks very much for my colleagues for organizing this event. I don't know if you guys can see me or if we have to go on gallery view or speaker view. I'm hoping everyone can see me. But yeah, as Frankie said, I'm a development and humanitarian professional, and I've recently founded an initiative called AID Reimagined, which I'm hoping could contribute to the evolution of aid towards effectiveness and justice. And I've always been interested in the conversation around decolonizing development and humanitarian work, or decolonizing development in general. I'm interested in this topic because, firstly, on the what, I'm always interested in thinking about what does decolonizing development mean, and what does decolonizing development look like, and how it affects us, and not just the people who work within the sector, but also the people and communities that we work with. But I'm also interested in the how, because decolonizing is also about the process and not just the result. So how we do things, how we operate in the organizations that we find ourselves in, and how we relate to each other as individuals. I think that is also influenced by decolonizing. And of course, apart from my professional background, personally, I'm also interested in decolonizing because I'm sure, like many of my colleagues here in this talk, I find myself somewhere in the middle. I was born and grew up in the global South, in the Philippines. But then within the Philippines, in many ways, I'm from a position of privilege. And then now working in the global sector, alongside colleagues from everywhere else, including the global North, in some ways, it's like a soul searching of who I am and, what my position is in this world, of trying to find out what does decolonize mean from my personal perspective. So I'm going to stop there. But yeah, thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Arbie. Maybe you can move on to Renzo.
Hello everyone. Good evening. Magandang gabi sa lahat ng mga nasa Pilipinas. Good evening to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon if you're from the other side of the world. Renzo Ginto here. I'm a public health physician who just actually returned to the Philippines. So I just finished my doctorate in public health at Harvard, focusing on the intersection between climate change and human health. But you know, as I've said, I'm back in the country, and I guess partly it's because of this, you know, thing in my subconscious. I really want to come back to the country to be able to contribute to nation building. My dissertation focused on climate change and health in the Philippines because of that idea that, you know, if I'm going to write a dissertation, a 200-page dissertation only once, might as well write about the Philippines. But I think this is part of my decolonial journey, my personal decolonial journey, trying to, create my own, find my own voice in the global conversation, maybe without staying in the global north, where I got my education. And with the hope that because of my presence here, I'll be able to help amplify, the story of the Philippines, the voice of the Filipinos in the global South, in the global health conversation. And for the past 2 years actually, I've been deeply involved in this evolving discourse around decolonizing global health. My romance with it actually started with a hashtag. So I tweeted about it, hashtag decolonize global health. And lo and behold, I ended up being part of this exciting, difficult, delicate, controversial conversation. And then now COVID-19 happens. And of course, I want to make sure we remember the more than, I think it's already 18 million to 20 million people already affected by the virus globally. I want to make sure we remember them. But COVID-19 is happening while these decolonial discussions are happening. And so, there might be something there. And of course, we can discuss that later. But global health right now has been upended by this invisible virus. And now, within our sector, we are doing a lot of soul searching. Later, I can share with you more what are the major discussions in global health as opposed to when it comes to decolonizing it. And also looking forward to hearing other perspectives from other sectors. So that's me, and that's my decolonial journey. Looking forward to our conversation. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Renzo. Before we go on to Ross, if anyone is on Twitter or on Facebook and you're attending this event and you want to tweet about it, our hashtag is hashtag Decolonize Everything. You can find it in the chat box if you would like to access it. And we now move on to Ross.
Good evening to everyone in the Philippines, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone else in different parts of the world. As Frankie mentioned, I am an attorney by profession with the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, which is the national human rights institution established by the 1987 Constitution of the Philippines. So it's a government body. However, the work bridges the gap between international as well as local human rights law and practice. So like Renzo, I also just got back to the Philippines. I came from Europe, from Italy to be specific, to pursue my Master of Laws degree with the University for Peace, which is the United Nations mandated university co-organized with the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute. So I am mainly a local human rights practitioner, but through my advanced studies, I was exposed thoroughly to the global conversation about human rights and how human rights has been talked about in the international circles. Before I left for Europe, I was teaching international law to undergraduate students in a state university. I saw the difference, in retrospect, I saw the difference between the pedagogy in human rights in terms of teaching it locally and how it is taught in an international or global setting. So there's a gap. And as I also saw how the local human rights discourse had certain nuances that are sort of eased out in the global conversation. So that's something I want to share later on. And human rights as a concept, not just as a legal concept, but as a normative concept, has shown its importance throughout this crisis. No, we've seen how human rights and public health have been intertwined at the very onset of this crisis. So I hope to share my insights regarding that. And again, I welcome everyone to this webinar.
Thank you very much, Ross. And last but not least, we have Regine, who'll talk to us a little bit about her work in peace.
Thank you, Frankie. Can I be heard? Okay, magandang gabi, good evening to everybody. My name is Regine. My friends call me Reg and my relatives call me Jin, so you can use either. I guess I'd like to just start casually by talking about experience, because this is really experience is what made me passionate about this discourse and what led me to the field I'm in. So I just finished maybe about 2 years ago my master's in coexistence and conflict resolution. But before I even got to that point, it was an entire experience of trying to find out like my own lived experience of decolonization. So I have quite a complex heritage myself. So I was born in the Philippines, and I have, like many Filipinos, I come from mixed cultural backgrounds. So my father, he's Filipino-Chinese, and my mother, she has some Sephardic Jewish heritage. So my great-grandparents, they were Jewish refugees from Spain during the Inquisition. So that's somehow, like, to cut a long story short, how I became interested in the peace field. But my very choice of my educational track was kind of like I don't know if I should say like an imposition on myself to decolonize, because I had offers from, say, Ivy League universities, but I chose to take a scholarship in a Jewish university in Waltham, which is an outskirt in Boston. And because of my personal desire to reconnect with a long-lost Jewish heritage, so I had the opportunity to do my research in both Israel and Palestine, and then reconnecting it back to here in the ASEAN region, in the Philippines, as a Filipino citizen myself. So becoming involved in, for instance, our very own Jewish and Muslim communities here in Manila, and also in Mindanao. So it's kind of like a double, triple decolonization, like tracing it back from my ancestors and my own lived experience as a Filipino. And also through my work experience, because after I graduated, and actually even before that, I started working for multilateral institutions. So I was with the ASEAN, and then or I had projects with the ASEAN Secretariat, and then after graduation, I worked with some UN agencies. But now I'm back home, and I must say I think I'm closer to where I really want to be, because I've been focusing on my own passion projects and advocacy movements with Asian Youth Peace Network, SDG Villages, and all of this is part of a coalition called the South-South Cooperation Circle. And so far, so good. Like, who knows what's next? But this is where I am at now, and it's something that I'd want to be able to share with you, like the experience of how I came to understand what peace and coexistence really is, and maybe how you yourselves can create your own paradigm on what peace and decolonization is for you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Regine. I really like the fact that you brought up experience, because it's from experience that we link theories and practice. So a lot of us have higher degrees, for example, and you've been working in the field. So I think that we can take some time to reflect about how do these decolonizing initiatives come out in the field of practice. And many of you work in that space between the global and the local.
And what do you notice? Are there any potentials there in your experience for bridging the two, or is it difficult in terms of decolonizing? So I think I'd like to hear a bit more about how this decolonizing drive works in your everyday practice and in your work experiences. So anyone can pitch in. You can start and look at the intersections as well of your fields, because I do think that, as Renzo mentioned, COVID has a lot to do with human rights, especially the way it's, we've seen that, how authoritarianism seems to grow amidst a pandemic, health-related pandemic. And development and peace, I'm sure, have many intersections where decolonizing initiatives are possible. So maybe you guys would like to talk a bit about that. Right. Anyone can start. Renzo, you want to start, or Regine?
Okay, yeah.
All
I was
right.
thinking, should we follow the original sequence? But maybe we should start disrupting, right? Because
Right.
as you've said a while ago, Frankie, we want this to be a really irreverent conversation in the spirit of decolonizing. So global health, and maybe it's the right place to start, because as we now speak, the biggest global health challenge is being confronted by the whole of global society, COVID-19. And COVID-19 really is, the funny thing is there's so many metaphors used to describe it. A lot of them war metaphors. It's a battle. Let's send the troops of doctors to the battlefield, etc. It just reflects our, our hidden obsession with colonization and empire and invasion. And so, I try to veer away from those metaphors. And instead, I think COVID-19 is really more of a mirror and a magnifying glass, reminding to us what is already, what has been already existing, the defects of our society, of our healthcare systems during the pre-pandemic state. So, the problems that we see, there's nothing new, really. And one of them is this innate coloniality, for example, in the field of global health. So just let me share some stories that happened in the past 5 months. So you hear French scientists implying that Africans should be used as guinea pigs for the new vaccines that are being studied at the moment. Or you hear Western media talking about problems in Africa with all white and all Western commentators, academics from Northern universities and think tanks. So these are just examples of, the colonial features of the global health sector just remanifesting. We have a new problem that is COVID, but those colonial attitudes and behaviors and practices have been existing for years, if not decades, whether it's, when we were still trying to address HIV/AIDS or, tuberculosis or, even mental health, which is now a very important issue as we now confront an epidemic of loneliness as a result of the lockdowns. But, the way we still, teach mental health in medical schools, the way we still treat mental health in hospitals, it's still very much based on the Western conceptualization of mental health and well-being. So those are just some of the examples. And in our sector now, we have started these difficult conversations about, research. You see a lot of papers talking about infectious diseases in Africa with no with no African author in the byline. Or, Western ideas and policies being imposed in developing countries without necessarily considering local context. So these are some of the discussions that we're having. And for sure, you're asking me about implications in practice. These are not just abstract conversations in the field of global health. These are real, practical activities, policies that have real implications on people's lives, especially in the global south. I'll stop there.
All right.
Can I just add on that, actually?
Sure.
Yeah, like your topic about global health is something that's, health is also sort of like close to my field, which is in humanitarian work. I once co-hosted a workshop on decolonization with a bunch of humanitarian aid workers. And I was talking about how, this should be decolonized and we should listen to the local people's voices, etc. And then somebody raised their hand and asked, wait, so, what does that actually mean? If we're facing, let's say, a cholera outbreak and we want to distribute, water purification systems, which, are a product to some extent of, global north science or global north technologies, whatever. Does that mean we're like being colonial? How does the decolonization operate in that respect? And I mention that because I think, particularly in discussions on this topic online or in social media, it's easy to caricature it. Decolonizing means this or decolonizing means that. And, rightly so, there's a lot of frustration from a lot of people in the global south that the tendency is to really push back hard on certain narratives. And I find myself sort of like in academic jargon, in the liminal space or in like the in-between of, recognizing that actually, there is a way to bridge, as you mentioned, Frankie, the global with the local perspectives. And it's not, it's not about the what, or it's not about the solutions or ideas per se, because people from the global south, it seems there's a caricature that, people from the global south, what we mean by colonization is a rejection of science or a rejection of technology or a rejection of global north thinking. Not really. Yes, of course, those things are important. And we agree on many of those things as well. But I'd like to emphasize the process and the relationship of these ideas. What I think colonization pertains to is around the process of imposing it. So, let's look at the example of the Ebola crisis, where, we learn from a lot of evidence and a lot of research that a lot of the interventions failed because local communities did not trust the organizations, the NGOs, that were coming into their community to impose this solution. And it's, from my perspective, it's not that the solution is wrong, but it's just how you did it. That's totally, unacceptable. That you did not build trust, you did not obtain consent, you did not, build on sort of like local structures and local capacities. And I think, I just wanted to respond to that question of how to bridge the local with the global, and to say that it's not that it can't be bridged, or it's not that there is a fundamental disagreement between the two, but actually it's more about the process. It's more about the how you approach, how you share ideas, and how you learn from one another.
Yeah. Jumping off from, you want to go ahead, Reg?
Yeah, I think you should be the last one. Because I've always felt like you're our anchor. But go ahead. Do you want to go ahead or me?
I just wanna hinge my point on what Renzo said about this whole pandemic. No, of course, at the start of the pandemic, there has been this moral choice, so to speak, that has been touted upon the people. Is it health and security versus human rights? And so it brings back again that debate that began during the 60s, I think, when the two main conventions, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, were being crafted. Of course, the Western democracies, in the historiography of human rights, Western democracies were seen to be more in favor of individual rights, whereas the third world countries back then seem to be more in favor of the collective rights. And so I think that tension is being brought back again in the context of this pandemic. And from experience, as a local human rights practitioner mainly, the rhetoric surrounding human rights should be reassessed. from that universalist perspective that is being taught even in law schools in the Philippines. From my own experience, it's being taught from a universalist narrative, from the viewpoint of a particular rationality, from a particular very utopian viewpoint. I think we have to start interrogating human rights again and how it is understood on the ground. For example, my work on EJK victims, the war on drugs in the Philippines. Of course, the state has been, to some extent, successful in its demonization of human rights as a concept. Saying at some point, I think there was a soundbite from a high government official that human rights is it's an alien concept to Filipino culture. However, I think this is instead of seeing this as a challenge to re-articulating human rights, it should be an opportunity on how we assert and how we talk about human rights, especially on the ground.
All right. Regine,
I want to jump on what everybody said because, well, from the peace point of view, you know, it's almost obvious like how interlinked peace is with decolonization because one came after the other, right? So really like, and I won't be able to talk about every single impact that colonization had on peace and vice versa. But what I really want to offer then is a paradigm shift, and maybe I'm going to try to interlink the experiences that I've had with what the other speakers have offered. And I'm going to start by saying that what Arbie and Renzo mentioned are quite important because they are the less obvious experiences of decolonization. So this year, from the UN point of view, it's actually the 75th anniversary of the United Nations 2020. So it means it's been 75 years since the global experience of the widest multilateral institution. But at the same time, a less frequently used narrative is that it also marks 75 years since the end of World War II. So that means a lot for us as a region, you know, of colonized nations. So I'm going to start by asking all of us and even the participants some questions. So I guess the first question is, with this understanding, how do we decolonize our own interpretation of peace? I mean, obviously, peace is not just the absence of war, right? Like we all know that already. And maybe I'll share an experience last June. That was the official celebration of the UN Charter Day when the UN Charter was signed, and I attended a celebration on the Russia side through the National Youth Council of Russia, and that's when I got to reflect on whenever we talk about peace and, you know, the end of war, which side of history do we celebrate, and jumping off from that, realizing in the current global order, like how do we have 5 permanent seats in the UN Security Council and have 9 countries have nuclear weapons, but all of these are really the obvious ones. At the same time, we also try to realize that with the gradual demise of hard power, you know, like now we are left with about 5 countries that claim to have such hard power. It also gave birth to a multitude of soft power, and that's how we have Arbie and Renzo, you know, talking about their own experiences in the humanitarian health development fields. So that brings us to another question, not just how do we understand peace, but also how do we sustain peace, and how do we decolonize the way by which we sustain peace. Because, you know, peace is interlinked with humanitarian aid and development and just the whole sustainable development agenda. At the same time, that's why I mentioned that Ross is really our anchor, apart from the fact that she's my favorite speaker. I think, you know, like if I can just be a bit philosophical, we could also ask a third question: how do we decolonize decolonization? And when we keep on talking about, when we offer our understanding of what should be decolonized, to what extent first of all, what do we mean by colonization? And then to what extent do we decolonize? And maybe that's where the discussion of the universality and non-universality of human rights comes in. I'm not going to answer that question for you because that requires, you know, a deeper discourse, a personal reflection, and also a communal discourse. But there, just to set the tone a little bit, and I'll offer some of my answers later on.
Can I just react on that, actually?
Sure.
And, you know, react to what a lot of my fellow speakers have said around sort of like narratives. You know, as Ross mentioned, there's this narrative that human rights is it's a Western concept. Oh, it's such an alien thing for global South countries like the Philippines, or that, you know, there is this narrative of peace from sort of like a global North perspective. And this is something that I'm definitely frustrated about, because one manifestation of colonialism or coloniality that I find is this claim to monopoly of these ideas, like, oh yeah, we're the global North, we're the ones who invented human rights, or we're the global North, we're the ones who you know, invented the concept of peace. And on the flip side, in aid in particular, there are also lots of people who say, yeah, aid is a colonial endeavor, which is, it is, as it is now. And it's always been colonial, and it's never going to be decolonial. And I'd also like to challenge that, because altruism is not colonial. Helping other people, you know, at the very basic root of it, helping other people is not a colonial act. And I think because of this monopoly of, you know, global North narrative around peace, health, human rights, development, it just frustrates a lot of visions and a lot of counter narratives from the global South. And I think that this is, you know, really important that we counter these narratives of global North monopoly on such concepts.
All right. Anyone want to add? Ross? I thought you were the anchor. Anyone would like to?
He's the favorite of Reg.
From my domestic, local and international studies of human rights, so there's already a conversation regarding the decolonization or unpacking the concept of human rights is into something that has to be interrogated. I've read somewhere that law is easy to decolonize, but human rights is difficult, precisely because there's a claim to universality when it comes to human rights. But then we have to question the whole history of that idea. Human rights, as the qualifier says, it's for those who are well treated as humans. And if you see in the Philippines in itself, there's Supreme Court decision. There's case law that looks at the non-Christianized tribes of the Philippines as people who are of a lesser status than the Christianized lowlanders, and so they were put under the auspices of the state at that point in history. So even though we have already recognized the concept of human rights at that point in our legal history, there has been that pronouncement from the highest court of the land in the Philippines that certain segments of our communities are not regarded as holders of human rights. So we have to unpack also not just the ongoing conversation and the ongoing narratives, but the history and the writing of the history of human rights itself.
Just quickly, I was triggered by what Ross just mentioned. I mean, first and foremost, I really like your invitation to going back to history, because well, colonization is a historical process, but you know, this present conversation will never be fully understood without truly going back to, you know, the evolution of not just events but really ideas. And the other thing is regarding this, you know, I think we're now in a conundrum regarding you know, human rights and decolonizing, and I'm just afraid that countries, societies that are now turning towards more you know, supranationalist, isolationist, kinds of trajectory or direction will be using or misusing the decolonial, language and message to excuse, as an excuse, for, let's say, human rights violations. Oh, it's a Western idea. We don't ascribe to that. That's not innate in our civilization from millennia ago. And so, then, we should not be bound by these international norms. So, I'm really interested in that, in trying to address that intersection and how lawyers like you, Ross, actually think about this difficult question. Thanks.
Of course, by profession, by trade, no, I'm bound by those legal norms and legal strictures, as it were, no. However, I think the conversation should go beyond the practical application of these laws, but sort of going into a more meta analysis or a meta interrogation of these concepts. It's interesting. It's interesting to see how we've conceptualized human rights as hinged on the document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when in fact, even before the UDHR, which of course celebrated its 80th birthday a couple of years ago, and it was very much celebrated in my workplace in the Commission on Human Rights. Instead of seeing the UDHR as the foundational event for human rights, let's backtrack a bit and look at the values that are embedded and enmeshed in the human rights discourse. That these are things that are present in every culture wherever you go, but and it's not really imperative to have an imperial center for the discussion on human rights. I think we have to start to diffuse and decentralize the idea of human rights as something universal, because we are humans, and the inherent human dignity that we possess. Because of that, we have entitlements against the state. We have entitlements for economic, social, and cultural rights. So it goes beyond just legal documents or international treaties and international agreements, but it's something more fundamental.
All right. Oh yeah. All right, Regine.
Okay. If I may just add quickly on history, because as a youth advocate, maybe we can approach that discussion also with an intergenerational lens. So as, I don't know, are we all Gen Y, some X, millennials, Gen Zs, or feeling Gen Zs? So we probably
boomers.
3 to 4 decades basically after the last World War, unless we were raised in conflict zones. So it demands depth of thought and a lived reflection of what we learn from history and our elders, and at the same time juxtapose it to the world we live in, like how we experience the current world we live in. For example, on the people written out of history, so we can take the experience of our friends who are Moro and Lumad youth, especially those who live in the urban areas. So it's quite interesting, how do they reconcile being part of a history that is still not documented in formal education books, because our formal education institutions are post-colonial, right? So, but then at the same time, being part of a history in the making. So especially for the Moro youth who live in the urban areas and they experience the day-to-day identity in the making of being a Filipino in Manila. So those two things are bound to each other when we talk about decolonization. And second, also, if I may add, it's not just historical, because not all ideas are bound just by time, but also space. So from ASEAN point of view, we really have to look at geopolitics. So it's never going to change that our waters are in between two superpowers 100 years ago until now. So it's something that we have to be very conscious about, that as ASEAN peoples, we have variables and constants. So we have variables of what our national identities are as island people, but at the same time there are constants such as our geographies. So we will always experience that security issue that has some repercussions from hard powers and also soft powers. So we will always be exposed in that kind of in that tension between the world powers, the new world order, or colonizers, however we want to call them, and us as ASEAN peoples. One concrete example from my field, the UN Security Council resolution passed a resolution on youth, peace, and security. So it recognizes, the narrative is it recognizes the role of the next generation, the positive role of next generation in building peace. So this I see, we can see it in two ways. The more normal or usual way, which is, this is a good resolution because it talks about peace. But at the same time, when we look at it from a decolonized point of view, how there is a risk of co-opting the peace discourse, as if it can polarize what is the good youth, or not even youth, but just the good citizen, and versus the bad citizen or the bad youth. So then we have to be clear on what we mean by peace building, because if we detach that from, say, human rights discourse, if we don't, for instance, if we don't see it as part of, if we don't see human rights defenders, for instance, as our peace actors or peace builders, then that in itself creates silos in society. You know what I'm trying to say? So we should be careful also of how peace narratives are being formed at the table. Does it, like I said at the beginning, peace is not just the absence of war, right? For all we know, human rights defenders and also liberation movements in certain contexts are those that are really the long-term peacekeepers. So yeah, that's just food for thought.
I'd like to draw on what everyone has said, and I do think that there are intersectional points between everything that all of you have said, and one of which is, I think, co-optation. We talked a lot about how these new narratives that are based a lot on local cultures and local practices can be co-opted by, let's say, authoritarian leaders, and we see this increasingly happening in the world, that they draw on a narrative of probably essentialist culture that is also anti-liberal, and they use that to enact further repression. So that's one, co-optation. There's also a one-way flow of expertise. So I did sense that at the beginning of this discussion, where Renzo and Arbie pointed out that it's usually the West telling the others what they should do, and kind of boxing everyone into these essentialist, somewhat colonial stereotypes. And you mentioned Africa, Renzo, so that's another thing, one-way flow of expertise. The necessity of self-reflection. So I do think that in any decolonizing initiative, you cannot extract your own upbringing, own experiences, and perhaps even your own colonial self out of the picture, right? So self-reflection is quite necessary when we're doing a lot of critical theory or critical self-reflection. And what's interesting is this interdisciplinary link. And we've seen that there are certain intersections that come out amongst all of you. And that I find, coming from the academia, I also find that interesting, as disciplines in themselves arguably are also colonial in nature. For example, anthropology, why does that exist, right? Why does sociology exist as opposed to anthropology, and so on? And I do think all of these disciplines were created in the 1800s when they had specific uses in the academe, and now we see these disciplinal boundaries that guided work in the past are now being broken down because of these interconnected concerns of the world. So you see that public health, for example, is also related to somehow food security, right? Or development aid and access. So moving into the future, of a decolonizing project, which I see as intersectional and interdisciplinary and stretching across all sorts of knowledges that were previously compartmentalized. How do you see this collaboration moving forward? And do you see that happening today, where there are experts from different fields that are not only from different fields, but also from different perspectives and different upbringings, experiences, geographic areas of the world, etc.? So do you see this in your practice moving forward? And if it does exist, does it move towards a decolonizing future? Right, maybe.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
That's such an interesting point, especially when you talk about like how it's really siloed. You know, these disciplines were invented sort of like with a colonial mindset. I recently read the book Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, which is who is an indigenous person from Australia, well, from the land that is now known as Australia, and he talks about this really because one aspect or one character of sort of like predominantly global North knowledge is abstraction. It likes to abstract things and it likes to box things separately so that they can create sort of like equations or whatever. And this is so prevalent in our fields. You know, in the humanitarian sector, we abstract people's needs. Oh, health sector, WASH sector, food security and livelihood sector. And then these sectors operate in silos. They have their own UN clusters or whatever, and they have their own teams. And sometimes it can lead to interventions or you know, projects that are not holistic. But at the same time, yeah, when we you know, organizations are sort of like structured in abstraction, in silos, like you know, some organizations have a development team and then a humanitarian team, as if those two things don't talk to each other, or you know, human rights, development, peace, but then it's all sort of like one continuum. And at the same, I'd also like to react on what was said earlier about just the future of these institutions, right? I think for Aid Reimagined, I tried to come up with characteristics. I developed a model that came up with characteristics of what an ideal aid sector could look like. And I think, you know, one of the things that I said is it's humane. And what I mean, what I mean when I say humane is that, as Reg pointed out earlier, a lot of things are, you know, coming from the North, but just because they're the first one to write it down. That's why in the book Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, he distinguishes between written histories and oral histories, and oral traditions. And this is where lived experience really comes from. Like, just because our systems, the way that we organize organizations and institutions and norms are, you know, based on this written sort of like history that does not prioritize lived experience, I think it takes away the humanity. It makes our systems inhumane. It puts us into boxes. Oh, are you a refugee? Do you tick all of these criteria? No, then you're not a refugee. So it takes away the humanity. And I think, yeah, if you know, one of the questions here in the chat is about methodologies. You know, how can we engage in research or in project, and what sort of like methodologies can we consider decolonized? And I think, you know, a humane methodology, there's a lot of conversation now around, you know, ethnography as like hanging out, or like, I think in Filipino it's pakikisama or something like that, like being one with the people. Yeah, it's considered a legitimate, or it should be considered a legitimate methodology, because, you know, you're not prioritizing a written abstraction, but actually a complex lived experience.
Right. Can I jump in? You know, your question, Frankie, is also about you know, the confluence of disciplines, and why is it important for decolonizing, but also, you know, for instance, I think about the need for a multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary approach in tackling COVID-19. You know, we know that a purely medical approach, while it can lead to the eventual suppression of the virus, can also lead us to neglect other important quote unquote side effects. I'm a physician, so I'm using a lot of medical metaphors. The side effects, right, of the COVID-19 response, the social aspects, the gendered impacts, the environmental impacts, because I work in the area of climate change. So one, multidisciplinarity is really critical, especially in this discourse around decolonizing. That's why, I'm just thrilled to have Arbie and Ross and Reg and you, Frankie, surrounding me. I'm getting a lot of insights as to how we can really enrich the conversation in global health. The decolonizing global health discourse is not new, but it's also not very old. And there is definitely room for further deepening it. I was always telling my colleagues, it's time to go beyond the cosmetic. Because right now, if you look at the emerging literature and op-eds around decolonizing global health, it's about having more people of color in the leadership of the World Health Organization. It's about putting more investments in building research capacity in the global south, so that they become first authors of research articles about the health issues that are important to them. So those are right now the discussions. But eventually, I think, and I really like what Reg was saying about the origins of the coloniality of many sectors, aid, health, how they all are rooted in the colonial nature of peace building, for example, and nation building. I think that's something that we in the health sector can benefit a lot from, so we can deepen the discourse and again go beyond this cosmetic increased representation. These are all important, but I think we need to go beyond that. And finally, Arbie referred to the question about research methodologies, and so that's also a wake-up call for medicine and public health. And I can, one example that I have in mind is, for example, the evidence around traditional, complementary, and alternative medicine, acupuncture. And you go to the West, and they will always say there's no evidence that says acupuncture works. When the Chinese civilization will always say, it's been working for millennia, in alleviating pain and suffering, and primarily because we are using Western research methods to analyze and understand Eastern medicine modality. So just by looking at that example, we need to start thinking about research methods that are appropriate and applicable and based on context, and not just transferred from one northern educational institution to another country tens of thousands miles away. Thanks.
Within international law in general, there has already been a backlash of sorts from Global South scholars. It's I think some of you would be familiar with that. It's called the Third World Approaches to International Law. There has been a debate on the nature of TWIL, as it's fondly called. Is it a theory? Is it a method? But proponents of TWIL, or at least adherents of TWIL, would say it's actually a movement, more than a theory, more than a method. It's an assertion of identity. It's an assertion of alternative voices that have been shunned out in the discourse of international law. And there's an interesting Twitter conversation going on now. Scholars of international law, I checked the conversation just now, and it's still ongoing. One professor of international law said that the problem with international law now is that essentially it favors the status quo, certain power structures, certain arrangements of power in the international sphere. And so young scholars would tend to just parrot out those ideas that have been echoed out through the decades of the development of literature in international law. To give you a practical example, I guess, of how international law has to be more nuanced in terms of its, and it has to reckon with its very Western and very colonial legacy. For example, the law on the sea. isn't human rights anymore, no? So it's veering away from human rights, but still within the framework of international law. When you talk about the law on the sea, it's already talking about this regime of law as custom. And what constitutes custom? It's state practice. It's practiced by most states around the world, and there's an opinion that it's binding on everyone. However, if you look at the maritime practices of local communities, they're not exactly in congruence with the customary law that's accepted internationally when it comes to usage of say maritime resources or of spaces in the ocean or in the sea. So again, the call is to localize the narratives, I think, and to look at the practices on the ground and see the disconnect, and hopefully to initiate that conversation between who we deem as gatekeepers of our disciplines, our respective disciplines, and the people who are actually affected by these policies in their everyday life.
All right. We're going to move into the Q&A in a bit. So if you have any questions, you can start posting them in the chat box. And like we mentioned earlier, if you're on Twitter, you can include our hashtag Decolonize Everything, right? Before we move into the Q&A, so just type away, guys, if you have any questions. I've got a bit of a question. To what degree does being decolonial and trying to fight against all these forms of oppression, right, have to do with being Filipino? So what is the connection between, do you think that I just attended a webinar recently, our book launch actually, and one of the authors said that he believes, Amador Peleo used to work at UP, that part of being Filipino is this desire to fight against let's say, the oppression or the negative aspects of all these nasty foreigners and all these nasty colonizers who came here and took everything and destroyed our institutions and ways of life, etc. And he thinks that that is a little bit intrinsic to our identity. What do you think about that?
I mean, I can start, but it's more of giving more trivia to our audience. So, as you can notice, and that's very obvious, we're all Filipinos here, and this webinar was actually a product of some random Twitter and Facebook conversation. So that's the power of the Filipino community, the diaspora, but also thanks to digital technology, it enabled us to meet in this platform, hence this webinar. But the second thing is that some interesting trivia about the Philippines. Next year, 2021, the Philippines, specifically the Philippine government, is actually commemorating, not celebrating, the 500th year anniversary of the arrival of Spain in Philippine shores. If you look at the website, they say it's the 500th year of the first victory of a Filipino against a colonizer. Because for the Filipinos in the audience, Lapu-Lapu killed Ferdinand Magellan, 500 years ago next year. And that's why Magellan was not able to finish the circumnavigation of the world, right? Alive, So in that whole circumnavigation, half of that he was alive, and then the other half of the journey, he was dead. He was, brought as a corpse back to Spain. And of course, that's also the 500th year of Christianity, the arrival of Christianity, the Christianization of the Philippines. So it's just interesting. And also another trivia, the name of the Philippines is named after a colonizer, Philip II. And so if our gang will really be very revolutionary about this, should we start calling for the renaming of the country in the spirit of decolonizing? I think that's a very interesting question. And then finally, I think I grew up in Calamba. I'm currently in Calamba, Laguna, and that makes Jose Rizal my neighbor. Rizal is the national hero of the Philippines.
Wow.
He's also a physician like me, but unlike me, he got executed at 35 years old by the colonizers. And I'm turning 35 in 3 years' time, and I don't want to be executed by neo-colonizers. but I think there's something to be said there in terms of the medical profession, and because I'm from public health and medicine, how we can contribute to the decolonial discourse. That has already happened more than a century ago. And now we're seeing that happening with, health professionals calling for a timeout and demanding for their rights. And you have a president that interprets it as revolution. Maybe we really need a revolution to really upend the current systems that continue the oppressions that we experience even in the age of a pandemic. I'll stop there.
If I may add to what Renzo said, because he gave a very good historical brief of somehow, I don't know, like what it means to be Filipino, or like maybe a point of reflection for us on what it means to be Filipino. And, I must say, we all know that there are many nuances to what it means to be Filipino, having 7,107 islands. And correct me if I'm wrong, but how many ethno-linguistic dialects do we have? Like a couple of hundreds? Okay, we don't know. Yeah. Sorry for being
We have about 183 languages, right? So separate languages, not even dialects.
Wow, there you go. And then all the more dialects, for sure. So, and connecting it back to my field, because peace is not just a discussion of security, of course, but it's an everyday experience of coexistence. So it's also a discussion on identity. And academically in our field, there's been a shift from studying vertical conflict, and towards horizontal conflict. So as a matter of clash of identities versus nations. And I think this is really like a lived experience for us Filipinos because of what has been mentioned, our different cultures and also even religions. So I guess it's a call to action to be more wary of these day-to-day lived experiences that we have, even as individuals. Like, for instance, how do we decolonize the sacred and the religions that we were born into? Oftentimes, the Philippines is described as a Catholic country, when in fact, it's a predominantly Catholic country, not a Catholic country. And maybe, there are all these discussions around halo-halo Catholic, because it's quite a Filipino practice of kind of like nitpicking what part of the religion do we practice, and what part do we integrate with our indigenous practices, or even our local rural practices. And then of course also decolonizing just nation building in itself, which is often Luzon centric. And then other parts of our identities, because us as decolonizers are not homogenous. So we also have to decolonize, for instance, our gender. So our projection or binary projections of gender. And then we can talk about, I've already mentioned culture, what else, like class. So we have to be, we have to try to use as many lenses as we can if we really want to be genuine in this task of decolonization.
Yeah, I super agree with it, Reg. And, it's fitting because our poster, our logo for this event is a jeepney. And jeepney is the most common sort of like public transport vehicle in the Philippines. And it looks exactly like that. And the origin of it is that, jeepneys, the Jeep brand sort of like vehicle was left by the Americans when they colonized us in the 1950s onwards. And then they left the Jeeps there, and the Filipinos turned the Jeeps into sort of like longer public utility vehicles and added all sorts of things to the Jeep. And then now it's, very much a very Filipino image. And I think that's so true for a lot of who we are. There can be all sorts of theorizing on why we're the way we are. We can say that, we're a bit insecure. We're trying to fight for our place in the world because we're a bit insecure because we've been colonized so many times and we've not been given the chance to really cultivate our own, and we're only known for mixing and matching, or halo-halo, what Reg says, mixing and matching other cultures. But I think what I'm going to say is, Yeah, I think firstly, I think, yeah, there is that, colorful history that comes with being a Filipino. And that's why, we all, it comes from our historical lived experience of being colonized by different sort of like entities. Economically speaking, we're one of the largest migrant sending countries in the world. That's why in almost any field, you'll always encounter a Filipino. I was so surprised, early on in my career, I was so surprised to sort of like just meet aid workers internationally who were also Filipino, and, seeing Filipinos in other sorts of sector. And yeah, I think there's something about us, whether it's, one suspicion is that, we came from a kind of like a seafaring culture. Our ancestors were in an archipelago, and they're always sort of like moving around and going beyond the shore. The smallest administrative unit in the Philippines is called a barangay. And that word came from balangay, which is the ship that our ancestors used to ride when they were crossing sort of like islands. And there's a certain bravery when, you look beyond the shore and want to venture out. And I think this may be just my suspicion, but I think we're also showing that kind of bravery when we say we want to reclaim our space and we want to reclaim the narrative from sort of like global North dominance.
Quick comment, Arbie. Wish Filipinos should not feel insecure because we're great in karaoke, in boxing, and in universe. Those are things that are very Filipino.
I just want to tell a short story from my LLM days in Europe. No, I had a Japanese professor, I had an American classmate, and a classmate from Barcelona. So we were drinking downstairs at the bar when my Japanese professor came down. And then I was talking to my American and my Spanish classmate. And when my Japanese professor came down, I emphatically said, in my drunken stupor, my collection is complete. My collection of colonizers is complete. So, and my American classmate, he's a lawyer. He at that point he told me, I didn't know that we actually colonized you guys for about 50 years. And yeah, that came as a surprise to me. But then again, I shouldn't have been surprised, no. But I seriously speaking, as a human rights worker, I think my voice should even not be the authoritative one in terms of local human rights experience. There are human rights defenders from the indigenous peoples communities. There are human rights defenders from the environmental workers, from the LGBTQI sector, from every sector you can imagine. And I think the imperative should be, again, to diversify voices in terms of human rights discourse locally and globally.
I'm really happy because we have a question from the audience. All right, we have a question from James, and James is asking, if I may try to summarize, we're a melting pot, and we've had all of these civica books and history books in elementary that describe colonial mentality that is still present in this country. And he's kind of hinting that we're insecure about this kind of thing. So can you talk a bit about colonial mentality and how that comes into your work, and how that's yet another step in trying to, that we have to overcome, right, if we want to decolonize? What do you think? Colonial mentality.
I think, yeah, maybe just to react, because I was the one who specifically used the word insecure. And maybe that's just projection from my part, because I'm insecure many, many times with this imposter syndrome, and with, someone, who's working in the global north and constantly being in sort of like global north spaces. And I'm like, do I really have something to contribute to this conversation? But anyway, yeah, I think, no, that was just sort of like an off comment on like, yeah, like maybe that's why Filipinos are known to have a fighting spirit, because we want to prove something, and we want to, we feel like we always have to prove something to the world, and we always want to speak up. And I think, yeah, I think that's a positive trait. Whether or not it stems from insecurity, that's just my off comment. And sometimes it does stem from insecurity on my personal part. So not to sort of like generalize it, but yeah. And it's interesting to point out as well the colonial mentality, which is a problem, because then, you know, it highlights the fact that just because we are from the global south, or we are, you know, some people who speak up, they're from the Philippines or they're locals, whatever, doesn't mean that they, you know, that they're perfect or they're right. And sometimes even their perspective, even my perspective, sometimes, you know, can be informed by colonial lenses, and that's an active, you know, that's an active way of unlearning and relearning and unpacking even my own sort of like biases and my own education from what I've learned in the past.
Who else? I can jump in. You know, regarding colonial mentality, and I know that's a phrase always used to describe, you know, we Filipinos. I'm sure other countries maybe are also using that, but as we all remember, when we were growing up, that is always being reminded to us, this fascination of Hollywood, this desire to receive that balikbayan box with Nike and Adidas and Hershey's, all these American products. What did I say, Frankie?
Spam.
Spam, of course, which, by the way, is a World War II, you know, emergency canned good. But here in the Philippines, it's like a delicacy. It's like, you know, you eat spam during special occasions, right? And so you know, I think that was like really, you know, embedded in our brains, and the challenge is how to you know, to get out of that, and to really be more embracing of our own culture, and be proud of our own culture. But on the other hand, this is the tension that I'm facing. Okay, let's break the colonial mentality. And, you know, right now the conversation internationally, even in the United States, you know, for example, food culture. Filipino food never really made it to the US food scene except in the past 3 to 5 years. Now we're seeing a lot of restaurants, very Filipino, started by second generation Filipino American, you know, youngsters, you know, the children of the immigrants. And you know, now the conversation is around how can we, the Filipino culture, become part of global culture. And on one hand, I feel some level of pride in, you know, that exercise, in that ambition. But on the other hand, I begin to question, in that process of, you know, trying to bring Filipino into the global culture, are we now starting to think like a colonizer, you know, like trying to behave like how the Americans or the Europeans have behaved when they were trying to, you know, diffuse their knowledge, their cuisine, their language, etc. So, you know, I'm pretty sure it's not an either or, a binary thing. There might be a sweet spot when, you know, we embrace global culture. We want the Filipino culture to also be showcased as part of it. But at the same time, not behave like a colonizer and approach this process from a position of humility. And you know, that's a question, you know, like how do we actually strike that balance in this journey?
All right. We have a couple of more questions here. Lexi D is saying, I heard that we tend to want to please people. We are pleasers. We have to be agreeable and not rock the boat. Not sure if that's also a byproduct of decades of playing into the model minority myth. So that might be coming from a diaspora perspective, but maybe even in the Philippines, we see this kind of submissive behavior, particularly when, you know, you're around whites, right? What do you think about this kind of behavior? Okay, all right. I'll read the other question. Maybe you can think about that. Does anyone find it unusual that once we advocate for diversity and the West catches up on it and uses it as some sort of subverted instrument, so kind of co-optation, did I understand that correctly, Jared? Or trend to appeal to us, but still while retaining an agenda to colonize? So co-opting the decolonial narrative, and yet using that same narrative to continue to enact the same structures, socialize everyone in the same universalizing way, and not really to maybe solve anything or make anything better. What do you think?
I'll jump in and share some example from global health, but I'm pretty sure it also manifests in other sectors. And I think the two questions are actually somehow related about, rocking the boat, calling for more diversity. And then now once we've entered the door, then that's it, right? Nothing really has changed. It's still the colonial mechanism with some sprinkling of people of color and global South voices. And, I've been part of those processes. I've been in boardrooms where I knew my presence was to make sure that the young, the Asian, and the brown-skinned are represented. And the way I approach it, and maybe, it's part my personality, but also part, empowerment. My mindset is always like this. Sure, use me as a token in this room, but I will make sure that I communicate to the room, to the powers in the room, that in the next time they hold a similar meeting, it should not be just me, and it should not just be a single representative to be in that room. And sure, I think the process will require, it's a step-by-step process. I can't expect, and maybe this is my more pragmatic side, I can't expect that in the next meeting, the whole room is already like the United Nations, right? But I think those initial, rocking the boat and, sounding the alarm and, conveying those kinds of messages will somehow help us bring closer to that kind of quote unquote decolonized, meeting or decolonized discussion that we are looking forward. So yeah, at least that's my experience. But again, it's maybe unique to me. But then I also make sure when a lot of other young colleagues from global health, hey Renzo, how are you able to manage it? There's a need for us to build alliances and mentoring relationships so that, there will be more like us who are empowered to speak up in a room with powerful people who sign your paycheck.
All right. I think this is kind of related to some of the questions that have been asked here. I do think a lot of the questions that are being asked or that have been asked in the last 2 minutes have been about this colonial mentality. There is a question here about whether how dark-skinned Filipinos are treated and other marginalized communities as opposed to maybe lighter-skinned Filipinos or those with of mixed heritage. I'd also like to acknowledge, for those of you who are into the chat, Danica Salazar from the Oxford University Press is here. Hello, and she answered this question about insecurity and gave an example about the English language, which is used in the Philippines and has been used for a very long time. And the fact that we still have to take IELTS and TOEFL, despite the fact that we've been speaking English for decades, hundreds of years, arguably. So I do think this is a great thing to look at if you're in the chat. We have another question here about social media. Does that hinder a national identity? How does that help? And maybe just a last question before we get to the final question. There's a long question here from Nasif Alyong. He's from Decolonial Studies program. He says it's difficult to define decolonial thinking and doing across time and space because of epistemological variations in the level of decolonial responses showed by the global South communities from their embedded colonial institutions, literature, norms, and practices. Not all Filipinos understand decoloniality or decolonization. How would you relay, I think this is a great question actually, a decolonial message that most Filipinos can understand, right, to make them more welcoming? So I think this is one of these great ending questions. So how do you make these ideas palpable to ordinary people in the Philippines? Challenge, ding.
I'll give a quick answer to the first couple of questions, especially like that we are pleasers and sort of like the dynamics of darker skin versus lighter skin Filipinos, etc. I think there is an interconnection with all of these things, in that I think it's part of our a dominant colonial mentality within the Philippines are colonial values. So we already problematize. So, for example, not being assertive or being meek or being introverted or being shy to speak up and wanting to sort of like keep the peace. Oh, and suddenly that's not that's undesirable. Oh, you're not leadership material, or you're not. It's problematic in that sense. Or oh yeah, you have to be lighter skinned. All these like skin whitening products in the Philippines, and I think like that's because as a society, unfortunately, a lot of us have been acculturated, have been taught in via colonial mentality, and that is it's not. I am more hesitant to place the blame on the individual level and say, oh look, you're such a colonizer in thinking these ways, but it's a systemic issue, right? Like these are the values, these are the norms that have been pounded on our brains when we were growing up and being shown these like white-skinned people on TV being being in the classrooms we were fined 5 pesos per word that is not English that we don't speak. Like so many factors is systemic, and this is something that we have to address and unpack, and it's not gonna be overnight, and it's a long process.
So Arbie doesn't call anyone an Oreo because they're brown on the outside and white on the inside. Okay, so guys, we're going to the last few questions. So one is this question of how do you make, maybe in a sentence or two, or maybe an idea, just a key idea, how would you make these ideas palpable, understandable to the Filipino, right? So that's the first question. I have another question to end this round. I think you'll find it very interesting and fascinating. So how would you make these ideas, what would you do, to make this more well-known? I think the social media idea is very interesting, though.
Right. I mean, I can start. I think the next decolonial conversation that we will be organizing should be in Filipino, in Hiligaynon, in Bisaya, in all those languages of our country, so that we can reach broader audiences and really bring these important conversations. I don't want to say to the ground, right? Again, that's another. In science, let's do field work. Let's go to the, to the ground. Let's, go to the community. I think that's also very colonial and patriarchal way of looking at, the other. And so yeah, that I think is my concrete suggestion. I don't have a specific answer yet as to how to package it, but I think we need to discuss more and discuss with more people using the language that they can actually understand to be able to participate meaningfully.
Also the medium, Renzo. So not just social media, of course, but our radio. I think we've underutilized our radio, the power of our radio, and of course, TV, mass media. And if I may add, with what Arbie said on not just blaming the individual, because we also see this in our organizations. And I think Arbie will also be able to add to this, how to decolonize our NGOs, because our very civil society has to adjust to this neoliberal, neo-colonial global governance system, So we see our NGOs as bureaucratic institutions that have that serve a purpose of just being bureaucracies and serving as banks of aid donors, versus genuine. I don't want to use trickle down, just like what Renzo was saying, but versus let's just say local action versus empowering grassroots movements. So I think we have to be wary also of how we like in our own organizations and in who are supposedly our allies, like the NGOs and the movements that we join. How do we practice what we preach in our own communities when we organize against colonization, and when we organize our decolonization efforts, basically.
Yes, and to also make sure, I think that the Global North institutions are not just socializing fields where they pick a few people from the Global South only to socialize them into the same kinds of patterns, behaviors, and ways of doing things. I think that's really important. All right, Arbie, Ross, want to answer this one-sentence question about how do you make the message more widespread across the communities?
Yeah, at the personal level, I'm still grappling with that. For example, why does it take a UN Human Rights Council document to tell us that there is a human rights crisis in the Philippines? Why is it that we need the imprimatur of the international community to tell us that something is wrong with our human rights situation? So that's something that I'm trying to play with in my head. But I think the one step is to make people not just aware, but to understand the immediate implications of this rights discourse on their safety, their liberty, their security.
For me, three things. I think like I'd start with saying that we should recognize the utility, the pragmatic utility of this kinds of conversations. These kinds of conversations, I think, has a particular audience, like us. It's a conversation for us, me, Renzo, Reg, Ross, Frankie. We are also trying to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thoughts and thinking and behavior. And this, conversation is a way for us to examine our own selves and, invite others within our own journey. And I think this conversation, people who are embedded in their local communities and local societies and their own ways of living, we don't need to tell them how to decolonize or whatever. This is for us who need to really reflect on ourselves. So there's that utility. And then the second is, as have been mentioned many times in this conversation, is that, to start with a lived experience. I think, we can, if a project is an analogy, we can come up with different sort of like projects of, oh, let's do this or let's do that. But if that's not what the people want, and if that's not what the people are already doing, then it's probably not going to work. Let's start with what they're already doing, what people's lived experiences are, and meet them there. And then lastly, I'd like to really underline the importance of stories, the stories that we tell ourselves and the narratives that we tell ourselves and the narratives that we create. As I mentioned earlier, there's this narrative that the West invented human rights and the global North are the leaders in health and the global North is the source of aid and is the source of development. No, let's try to change that stories. And I love what Ross said in the beginning. Let's decentralize these messages. Let's decentralize these ideas because we have a shared humanity, and truth, knowledge, progress, quote unquote development isn't and shouldn't be monopolized by any one person or one body. Let's decentralize these things and change the story.
We have one last question. Actually, there are two questions, but I'll try to incorporate one of them into what I'm going to ask now. So Mahalia Fernando is asking, is there a way to accept aid and yet still carry out an inclusive decolonized methodology in carrying out a development project? It was kind of answered a bit before, but I'm going to link it to this next last kind of question. There is a famous host in the Philippines, so he appears a lot on TV. He's called Boy Abunda, right? And he has this question about looking into a mirror. So if you were to look at yourself, your decolonized self in the mirror, you've got a mirror in front of you, and in that mirror is your decolonized self, what would you tell your decolonized self? Try to be brief, please. And maybe Arbie, as an additional challenge, you can try to incorporate what Mahalia is asking. So what would you tell yourselves? Look into the mirror, your decolonized professional self. What would you tell yourself?
I would tell myself, thanks for trying. And I say that because,
Self-care.
there are a lot of questions here. Can aid, can sort of global north projects, can the system as it is now be used to decolonize? And the answer is, who knows? Nobody knows. We can only try. I personally, recognize my positionality, and I am born in this world in a certain way, and I now occupy spaces that I occupy, and I work within institutions that I work in, and we all operate in systems that are thrust upon us, and that are hard to change. Can we do it? We don't know, but we can try. And I think, that if I meet my decolonized self, I'm sure my decolonized self would tell me, thanks for trying.
Maraming salamat po. All right. Anyone else? What would you tell Reg?
Bongga kaday. Sure.
Bongga kaday. All right.
No, I'm going to say congratulations for your privilege.
Oh.
Because, I think ultimately decolonization is about agency. It's not just about decolonization, really. We should be talking about sexism, racism, classism.
True.
But the root of this is oppression and trying to empower agents, right? So, but that comes with, unfortunately, without structural change, privilege. And we can go backwards like the conservatives, or maybe move forward ahead, if that's how they want to put it, the liberals. But we need to recognize what Marx said on historical materialism. So,
yes, Marx.
Yes, because Ross is my favorite speaker. Ideas arise only as products of material conditions. So we should recognize our privilege whenever we try to get into decolonization. That's all.
Borrowing from a nursery rhyme. Are we there yet? And probably the answer is not yet. It's a continuing journey. So I hope my decolonized self, even when she reaches that point of better understanding, still continues the journey towards comprehending all these complex and nuanced issues.
Okay.
Ako, you found your voice, you discovered yourself, and thanks for being a participant in creating the space so that others can find their own voice and their own self as well.
Okay, all right, that's great. Wow.
Wow,
Okay.
Lorenzo.
I'd just like to comment on two things before we end this great kwentuhan. We have Carolina Schöpf in the chat, and she said that there should be probably reparations for what was done to the global South. Global tax system that offers everyone a decent income, so maybe basic income. And we have here a question about policy-oriented research, and I'd like to take that question and say that there is, in fact, a decolonial studies program at the Center for Integrative and Development Studies at UP, which is actually a policy think tank. So that is our way of trying to get this kind of discourse into policy. And we have a conference too, and that's coming up in September. You can ask us further questions or get to know more about it, and also the people here on the Decolonial Studies Research Network on Facebook. So if you're interested in policy related or maybe even aid related, all of these fields have been posting quite excitedly on the Decolonial Studies Research Network page on Facebook, so you can join us there. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. If you want to include us in your posts on Facebook and Twitter, TikTok, you can include hashtag Decolonize Everything and ask us further questions through the Decolonial Studies Research Network page, or approach each one of us personally. So thanks everyone for coming tonight, and we wish you a good day, good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Salamat. Good night.
Salamat.
Bye.
Ingat kayo. Take care.